before we get into the tomahawk statement from President Trump through my crunchy mic in this interesting location for today's stream, I want to make sure that we have a little bit of background as to where the war stands at this point. So, we've heard a lot of commentary about who is winning and who is not winning the war, right? And this is how people seem to, the casual couch potato observer, seems to say who's winning or not winning the war. It's dependent upon A, territory being taken. Does it matter what territory is being taken? No. If it's a giant farm field that you lost 200 guys for, it will be considered as much of a triumph as if it is a small village of some actual local tactical importance that might give you a flanking position on other locations that you want to advance upon. It's all viewed as the same. It's measured in total terms more than it is measured in strategic value. And so a bunch of farm fields is then given the same importance as, say, a logistical node or a urban center that is of some defensive usefulness to those on the defense here, which has largely been the Ukrainians. And so through that observation, people have come to the conclusion that the Russians are winning. Now, that's not the only way that you dictate who is winning or not winning a war. It's one thing you can look at, the amount of territory that's taken, not just saying, has territory been taken, yes or no, but how much territory has been taken, how much territory over that time, the usefulness of that territory that has been taken, has there been any territory that has been retaken, has there been any territory that has been attempted upon but has not been taken, which is something that is usually not thrown out there in consideration. If somebody tries to take one location 5 times and fails, tries to take another 3 times, fails twice, succeeds once, it's just considered a victory. Even though in total terms, it could be quite like a Pyrrhic victory. It could be a victory where, yes, you've taken this farm village, but now you don't have the resources necessary to take the more defensible lines that have been prepared on the third line of defense set by Ukrainian defenders or around this urban location. And so it's a pretty shallow way that people have looked at whether or not somebody's winning the war. You need to also include the industrial side, the expansion of industrial production to see if they can support the logistics that the war demands. You need to include the energy war. You need to include the will to fight. Because if the energy problems happening in Russia right now, the budget problems, the tax increases, and the fuel shortages continue, this can take a largely apathetic public to the war and turn them into a public that has some amount of discontent. The one time you saw Putin really drop in popularity for the entirety of the war was when they went out and started getting private conscriptovich more involved, expanding the conscription, and that's the one time you saw Putin actually take a multiple-digit drop in support in the war. And that's why since then, the government has been very hesitant to try to do any sort of mass mobilization, even if a mass mobilization would make it much cheaper in comparison to the 5,000, 6,000 crazy amount of monthly pay that they're promising to soldiers that they simply cannot afford in the long term. They continue to go forward with this model, even as it brings diminishing returns, even as it brings older and older conscripts. With the start of this year, 2025, the average age of the Russian volunteer being 50 years old. It raises the age of the volunteers, not the conscripts, obviously. They have problems when it comes to will to fight. The fact is that most people are not volunteering now out of patriotic fervor, but out of a desire to get paychecks, to pay off debts, sometimes to get out of prison time, whatever is possible. Where the Ukrainians are much more willing to, hello, you've been conscripted, congratulations, welcome to the war. In fact, this is an issue of some social discontent inside of Ukraine, but the Ukrainians have determined, and this is widely supported in society with over 60% from the existing polling that is available, that they are supportive of continuing the conscription program, even if themselves they might not go volunteer. So there's a lot of avenues you could look for who's winning or losing the war. Will to fight, the economics of the war, how long the war can be sustained, losses, and how much men you are losing, because if you have 1,000 men, you lose 500 men, but you take one village, you got to take 3 villages, you have a problem, right? And of course, as we said before, territorial exchanges. So I say all this because I wanted to show you guys this image. You know, it's not the best screen cap in the world. I showed this to my friend before stream. He bullied me over it. He called me many, many, many mean slurs. It was very offensive. But this shows a Ukrainian excursion into Kursk Oblast. This shows Ukrainian territorial holdings in the Kharkiv region near the city of Kupiansk and how they've been able to hold Kupiansk. It shows Ukrainian territorial holdings in the south of Donetsk that were still present earlier in the year. And it shows, the situation in Zaporizhia as it was about a year ago. So this is the situation as it stood roughly a year ago today, and there's the situation as it stands today. The reason that I take the time to start today's stream by breaking down all the ways you can judge how the war's performing isn't because I'm here to convince you that Ukraine's winning, Russia's winning, Donald Trump's winning as always. I'm here just to say that the framework by which people simplistically try to describe one side as winning and part in place of the other is brain dead, and it is done by couch potatoes, most of whom have never been near a battlefield, don't know anything about the war really, and are just simply looking at a statistic every few months and putting it away, and that's their total deep dive into the bounds of the war. Because understanding the amount of losses Russia took to go from this to this, when again the war was supposed to be in a quick short burst. If you see that green on the left side near Kiev, that was their march on Kiev when they tried to take the capital. You can see the losses in Kherson. You can see, though, in some areas they've been able to move forward slightly. In the Kharkiv Oblast, you can still see the green from the Kharkiv counteroffensive that still largely those territorial recaptures have been maintained. You can see Ukraine has had losses, mostly in southern Donetsk, as 1/3 of the Donetsk Oblast remains now unoccupied. You can also see that the Russians have completely taken over the Luhansk Oblast, the 1 to 2%, including the Srebrenytsky forest, which I spent quite some time in with a BMP crew. It was interesting there in the forest, this tiny little strip of Luhansk that was still unoccupied. Now it's been occupied. So there has been territorial gains. But when you talk about the strategic usefulness of what has been gained in this time period, the Kursk Oblast had diplomatic usefulness at the table. When you talk about the gains that they've made in Zaporizhia, it's basically nothing. If you talk about the gains that have been made over in Kharkiv, the largest gain so far has yet to be turned into fruition, and that would be them recrossing over the river, which they've done, and taking Kupiansk, which they haven't done. They're in the north of the city of Kupiansk. The situation has stabilized for now. I wouldn't be surprised if in the future they took it, but the question isn't whether or not if the Russians take Kupiansk, Russia wins the war. If the Russians take Pokrovsk, which they were trying to take winter of last year, and now we're entering into winter of this year. When I left 2 or 3 months ago, I thought that Pokrovsk might well fall in my leave, and so that's why I scheduled the filming the way I did when filming the Pokrovsk documentary. I started with Pokrovsk, and now I'm finishing my Konstantinivka documentary. This week, I'm headed back to the front to finish filming all around the Donetsk-Konstantinivka axis in that general area. Where exactly in that area, I will not say. I will just say it is somewhere in Ukraine, around the Donetsk and Konstantinivka region. So there you go. There's your thousands upon thousands of square kilometers to speculate upon. But I scheduled it that way to go back on that axis because I thought Pokrovsk would fall first. Likelihood is that will still be the case, that if these cities fall, it will be the one to fall first. And Russia still has some resources. It still has fuel in the tank. It still has other military units stationed in other areas of occupied Ukraine that it can pull from. It can try to increase its recruitment numbers by putting another $1,000 on top of the monthly pay for the volunteers. But is this sustainable? If this has turned into a war of attrition, which at this point I would say it has, I would say the war of maneuver, the last glimpse of an attempt at it was probably the 2023 counteroffensive. Everything since then, it has been largely a war of attrition. The only exception I would throw out there would be the excursion in the Kursk Oblast, but that was, I would say, isolated. And the resources that Ukraine would need to do something like that again at a larger scale to turn it into a war of maneuver, I am not convinced that they have. And the Russians have not shown the ability, even if they were to pull upon other resources like, conscription and stuff, to engage in that war maneuver yet. They tried something in the Sumy Oblast. It did not go well. They tried something in the Kharkiv Oblast. It did not go well. They've tried some larger scale mechanized offensives. It did not go well. And so they've largely resided themselves to soldiers covered in thermal blankets crawling across farm fields, trying to build up 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 infantrymen into a tree line before they charge against the bubbles that dot the country line, the front line of little Ukrainian emplacements. Because most of the front line isn't really a traditional, I guess you could describe as front line as people imagine in the World War I style descriptions that you get, but really a bunch of positions dotted across the front line that are supported in between by essentially a wall of drone cover. And quick response teams that if there is some sort of limited breakthrough or penetration, which I think is probably the best describing word, for example, what happened around Dobrpila before it was, quickly jumped upon by response teams, those quick fire response, firefighting brigades, I remember when I was talking to one of the commanders of the convict soldiers, he described them like firefighting teams. Essentially, wherever the fire starts, they're sent in to clean up the fire. That's what the Ukrainian front line has developed into. So if you judge it from that position, then you could say the last year of Russian gains obviously have been painful for Ukraine. The losses have been painful. The cost has been painful. And there have been locations that have been lost. Kurakove, obviously, it's going to be painful for the people there. Constantinople also, you're talking about southern Donetsk. I spent time there. I filmed civilians evacuating from there. It's very sad, but we need to talk about strategic usefulness if we're talking about a war, not just the humanitarian side of it. And these are not strategic behemoths. They're not. I mean, the biggest, I would say, real strategic, not tactical, but even I would say thing that's closest to a strategic gain that the Russians have made territorially in this time frame would be the crossing over officially from the Donetsk region into the Dnipro region, and all of the other locations that are now thrown into peril due to the fact that they are able to move into the Dnipro region. Not Dnipro city. I've seen some people hear Dnipro region. Again, these are armchair commentators who cover every topic in the world and decide to drive by Ukraine while reading the headlines. I've heard a few of them say, oh, Dnipro city is Dnipro's about to fall. They're on the very, you can even see it here. They're on the very border of Dnipro region, just on the border, crossing over. But this, it throws into peril the advancing Russian forces, like Hulepole. It throws into peril Pokrovsky, which is an actual logistical hub, not Pokrovsk, different location. A logistical hub about 15 kilometers from Russian positions there. So that would be the biggest strategic gain, but that strategic gain is they've entered a region which opens up possibilities. Not that they've achieved these things, but that they've opened up possibilities. So when you think about the amount of personnel that Russia has bled through over the last year, the will of the Russian public to continue the war, which, while so far it astounds the soul how much the Russian public is willing to put up with for this war, a year does not pass by without stress. Not only on the economy, making it harder for people, but also on the loss of life. People do not lose their children and their sons without some amount of moral and social and emotional burden. So I would say that the territorial side of the Russian advances over the last year, they advanced, but they didn't capture anywhere of large strategic importance. And the question is whether or not before the end of this year, they're going to capture cities like Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, which were the goals for Russian advances last winter. And so if we're still talking about the same 30 to 50,000 population density size urban locations that we were talking about a year ago, then I don't believe Russian commanders are excited about the rate of advance. And when I watch Russian state TV and I see some people bringing up, within 100 days, we're going to be passing the length of the Great Patriotic War for how long this went on. Has this made it better for society? And I'll see all these responses and all this pushback, because the idea on these programs is you build up the idea that somebody might be thinking at home, like, has this been worth it? And then you tear it down. Before they even started engaging the teardown process, the first thing out of the pro-war bloggers' mouth was, while yes, the advances have certainly not been anywhere near the speed that we wanted. Okay. Now, this wouldn't be a problem if Russia was the boundless, endless ocean of manpower and resources that fairy tales and Twitter threads seems to imply. But they're not. They're a nation like anyone else. They have a third of the population the United States does. They have resources, so does many other countries, including many other countries that support Ukraine. And as long as they're not willing to tap into that apathetic public to fill the ranks of the armed forces, which is this threat that has been bounced around for the last 3 years, anytime Russia, runs into any military difficulty, then this is not a endless fuel tank. This is a country that can run on empty just like any other. And so I think that all of this is important in the context of this recent statement from Donald J. Trump on the Tomahawks. Let's pull this up. Oh, wrong thing. Oh, wrong thing again. This is interesting, though. Did you guys see this? This is a Ukrainian soldier defending his position with a Steam Deck, sponsored by Valve.
Ответочка пошла, да? Давай повоюем, демон. Давай.
Mom, you shouldn't have attacked me for playing all those video games. These are life skills, okay? These are life skills. I will use this to defend our village, Mom. Okay? Let me play Pokemon. Now, look. Here is Donald J. Trump talking to the press. One of the members of the press asked Donald J. Trump, hello, we know that Zelensky has asked for Tomahawks. We know that the United States is in discussion with the Ukrainian government over providing Tomahawks. Is the U.S. government going to provide Tomahawks? Now, I am of the belief that we're not. The reason I say I don't think we're going to do this, I touched on this briefly last time, but I want to touch on it in more detail now. Right now, we have about 8 to 16 launchers, ground launchers, for the Tomahawk. Now, there's other ways to launch Tomahawks. You can launch it from, naval craft, for example. But the problem is the Ukrainian Navy, and now I say this as somebody who's embedded with the Ukrainian Navy before, they don't have a lot of ships that could. And if they do, those ships obviously would be under certain risks if they tried to get in locations that they could, especially, depending on some of the energy infrastructure that is the purpose of providing this type of weapon to them in the first place. So likely, right, now I'm not going to pretend that Ukrainian ingenuity cannot open up new possibilities or unseen ideas, as I am not an engineer, okay? I was a Lincoln Log kid, less a Lego kid. There was too many pieces. I think a ground launch system is probably the likely scenario if we were to provide it. But with only 8 to 16 launchers in the entirety, and 8 to 16, it's probably 8 to 12, but some number in there, right? Say 10, 11. How many of those launchers are they going to want to provide to the Ukrainians? And let's say we provide them with 2, and then they lose 2. What are the Ukrainians going to do? They're going to come back and ask for more. And if we only have like 10 launchers and we just gave 20% of our supply to the Ukrainians, and then they blow up, as might happen, as you would expect to happen on a battlefield where the Russians are doing everything possible to try to stop the pressure on their oil refineries after having over 20% of it taken out and disabled by Ukrainian drone attacks, after all these bombings that have cost them immense money and repairs and shortages, and the stopping of fuel exports to try to stabilize the domestic economy. They're going to do everything they can to take it out. So then they take out these 2 launchers. What's Trump going to do? Is Trump going to send 2 more? And then it's going to be, we've sent the Ukrainians 40% of our fleet. We can try to make more, but that takes time. Those are contracts that would have to be fulfilled, that I'm sure would be after contracts that would have to be negotiated. And so I just don't think that Patriots Patriots already made sense. We already sent Patriots, but Tomahawks make sense. Tomahawks are just the weapon that people are naming because it's the weapon they know. There are other options for longer range missiles that could be sent, that could be used to target Russian energy infrastructure, which is the pitch to the Russian government, that we're doing this to target Russian energy infrastructure so the war can be shortened, so the war does not carry on, so the war does not go on and on and on and on and on. So I think if anything is sent, it's going to be maybe some Cold War legacy system. Maybe it will be a other type of missile, but whatever long-range system that is sent, I don't think it will be a system that has a limited supply of launchers. And if it is, it's going to have to be some old war legacy system that I cannot think of right now, that has already gone out of fashion and therefore we do not need. Now, that's why I expected there to be no Tomahawk announcement. And there was even some reporting in advance of this statement from Donald Trump that the Tomahawk decision was unlikely from some inside officials. So everything in my mind seemed to point towards the idea that we weren't going to send the Tomahawks. That doesn't mean we're not going to send anything, but we're not going to send the Tomahawks. Then Donald Trump said this today.
Decision on whether to supply Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine or sell them to NATO and let them sell them to Ukraine. Yeah, I've sort of made a decision, pretty much. If you can say.
Okay, so the question is, because it's kind of hard to hear, but have you made a decision on whether or not you're going to send the Tomahawks to Ukraine?
Missiles to Ukraine or sell them to NATO and let them sell them to Ukraine. Yeah, I've sort of made a decision, pretty much. If you consider, I think I want to find out what they're doing with them. Yes. Where are they sending them? I guess I'd have to ask that question. That war should never have started.
And then he goes into his usual spiel, war shouldn't have started, Biden war, you get the idea. But that's the important part. That's the policy. And thank God there are brave souls out there who edit this stuff down, because this was actually part of a 40-minute press conference as part of infrastructure investments in Alaska. And 4 minutes into it, I watched it, and 4 minutes in, just off. Alaska, goodbye, Alaska, hello, every other topic. And it kind of, it goes all over the place, as is the case. But, we got this little cut. So from the way he responds here, he responds, I've pretty much made up my mind. We're now just talking about what they're going to do with it and where they're going to hit. Now, this could be in reference to a few things. What I think it could be in reference to is currently for the launch of long-range missiles into Russia using American tech. And that's an important distinction. Not American weapons, American tech, meaning that if the British Storm Shadows have to be approved in this way too. French Scalps and anything sent by any other European power that uses American tech, which is quite a bit. My God, there's one fly in here that's harassing me. I need air defense systems right now. any American tech, they can do export controls. And they actually did this to a bunch of Abrams that the Australians were literally going to blow up. Were going to destroy because they did not need it. They were going to do munitions disposal. The Trump administration early on blocked it in order to put pressure on the Ukrainians, not to add fuel to the fire, as Hassan used to say. Anyway, so they can restrict those from being sent, and Pete Hegseth has been in a position where he is directly okaying or saying no to launches into Russia against oil infrastructure and such. And it has been reported that there have been times where they said no. So that means that there's probably a process by which, and this would not surprise me considering how Trump likes to be in the room for these things, where these weapons might be sent, but they're going to have to get U.S. approval on all these strikes. Meaning that there's not going to be a situation where the Ukrainians get these missiles and the Ukrainians, at a time of their own choosing, can lob them at Russian infrastructure dependent upon what they think will cause the most pain in order to bring the war to a conclusion. Instead, it will be what they think will cause the most pain after the Trump administration agrees, and it's not something that could, say, hurt America's national interest. Now, the clearest way something could hurt America's national interest would be something that spirals out of control. Say, Zelensky says we're going to use one of these missiles to bomb the walls of the Kremlin. I think somebody like Donald Trump, or really any U.S. president, is going to say that's too escalatory, that's unnecessary, this has very little strategic gain, with the possibility of extreme reaction, right? So that's something that they would want to stop, something they would want to deny. I don't think the Ukrainians would want to waste munitions on that. I don't think they would, but that's just a scenario. Another scenario, a more interesting scenario, at least to me, would be the direct targeting of Russian export infrastructure. See, you're never going to be able to stop all of the fuel in Russia's soil from being in Russia's soil. You can't get rid of that. And you can try to stop the pumps. You can attack the refinery process, which is what Ukraine has been doing, to make it so they have to export crude instead. And because they're adding so much crude into their export, the price of crude also naturally goes down, which then, of course, compounds the effect. But it's one thing to, try to go to war with the production of fuel. It's another thing to just go to war with their ability to export any fuel. And it is true that Russia has suspended certain gasoline exports, but we're talking about gasoline exports. LNG being shipped on shadow containers, that type of stuff is still going on. But if you were to target the ports and the loading infrastructure by which these barrels and these shipping containers are put onto Russian ships that are sent around the world, then they can produce all the fuel that they want in the country, dependent upon, of course, the ability to refine or not refine. But if you can't export it, then you can't sell it. Now, there is, of course, the possibility of having like physical infrastructure instead of these, ports, like, for example, pipelines. But the pipelines into Europe, they still give some return to the Russians, while, they used to export 40%. Now they export 19% of their energy exports to Europe. So still a sizable portion. Hungary and, of course, Slovakia being the most known consumers of Russian energy and the most unrepentant consumers of Russian energy and funding the war effort. But that is a investment that's getting diminishing returns as more and more Europeans turn away. And there is no physical infrastructure that could give them the sales in Asia to India to China to make it up. There is ideas about it. There's this idea of the Siberian pipeline between the Chinese and the Russians, but the Chinese understand the diplomatically difficult position that the Russians find themselves in. And no matter how much you want to talk about BRICS, no matter how much you want to talk about, multipolar solidarity or whatever you have in your head, the Chinese want the best price they can get on fuel exports. The Chinese have their own economic problems, and wherever they can take advantage, they believe they'd be fools not to. And so what they say to the Russians is that the Russians need the Chinese to buy their export a lot more than the Chinese need to buy Russian export. So you need to make it worthwhile for them. Therefore, we want to buy your fuel at a discount. Okay? That's how the Russians have just had to go about things. But the Chinese also want the Russians to be the one to put in place the infrastructure for that pipeline. So that means they're the, gosh dang, this one fly, I swear to God, one of these days we will establish deterrence against these flies. They're the ones who have to build the infrastructure, put it in place. And the Russians simply cannot afford to do it at this point. The Russians have continued to negotiate with the Chinese, and it has gone nowhere. So where does that leave us? Well, that leaves us with a vulnerable economic position for the Russians geopolitically when it comes to their trade due to the sanctions policy, vulnerable because of the targeting of refineries, vulnerable because of the fuel shortages domestically and the ban on gasoline exports, and vulnerable due to the possibility of further tightening of restrictions on the shadow fleet, the interception of their shadow fleet craft, and the possible continued targeting of their export infrastructure as well as the refining infrastructure, not only with the ever-expanding Ukrainian drone program, but something that would really be a problem for the Russians, American missiles. If American missiles are provided that can go 600, 700, 800 miles, something of some length that can reach deeper and deeper past Moscow towards the refineries that keep the Russian energy companies afloat, towards the infrastructure that allows them to finance the war, well, then the Russians are going to be in a difficult position. One that, in Trump's view, might be a lot more amenable to the idea of a short-term to medium-term solution. Long-term solution, I think that's something that would require maybe more on the battlefield. You would hope they'd be ready for a long-term solution, but, hope in one hand, crap in the other. I need a no-fly zone. That's exactly what I need. I need a no-fly zone. The question really is, though, quantity. And this is also why I didn't think we were going to give the Tomahawks over to Ukraine. We just simply don't have the quantity in launchers. We'd have to give them quite a sizable portion of our launchers that doesn't make sense depending upon what they've said about what we need for the future of American defense, the restrictions, how our stockpiles are running low, and on the blocks on aid to Ukraine, dependent upon review by the Pentagon twice, even though there were other times that they attempted it that was blocked. And these times, I'm not even saying that Trump decided these. These could have been decisions made under his nose. In fact, I suspect that Pete Hegseth was making these decisions independent of the president of the United States. At least that's how it behaved, because when Trump was asked about it in public, he said he didn't even know. And as much as Trump might be, wheeling and dealing, he might know how to scheme, I don't think he wants to look like a fool in public. Knowingly. Somebody released the fly swatter restrictions on Dylan. Honestly, actually,